check out the beans of a toddler's head.
15-gallon grow bag.
Stage of red.
I guess it wouldn't be too surprising.
That we have here in the greenhouse.
Hello, welcome back to Sage and Stone Homestead. My name is Heather. The loofah vine coming in the archway of our garden has not only reached the top, but we've gotten probably at least 3 feet on the other side of the arch already.
There's 2 loofah plants planted here, and they go up and over, and this is the longest one so far. I have been coming through and kind of weaving them through the trellis.
We have some pretty decent winds here, and if I allowed the vine to just lay on top of the trellis, the tendrils might be strong enough to hold it down, but it just adds another layer of protection if the vine is kind of woven through the cattle panel.
As you can see, we have some blooms. This one here is a male flower. It's not attached to anything at the base, it's just this little stem. That there is a male flower too. I'm seeing mostly just the male flowers this morning, which is normal. It is normal to just see male flowers at first, but then eventually you'll see some female flowers with little tiny loofah attached. Can you see that? Isn't that cool? Next to that flower, we have this one. This loofah was already pollinated earlier in the week, and you can see the growth.
I've noticed quite a few open flowers like that, a few open female flowers, and I have assisted them in pollinating. I mentioned it last week with the pumpkin patch that sometimes when it's only a few blooms open, the bees have a hard time kind of finding them. It's usually a larger quantity of blooms that really draws in the pollinators. But did you guys notice the ants crawling on the loofah here?
It's kind of early in the morning, so there's not as many, but sometimes you'll see this on your plants. Sometimes it can mean that you have an aphid problem, but also there is nectar inside these flowers, and the nectar is sweet, so sometimes that can attract the ants. I really wouldn't worry too much about this unless you're noticing something else like aphids going on, but usually you don't see aphids on loofah.
Or cucurbits for that matter. I don't know what it is, but usually aphids are not on these types of plants, at least not in my garden.
I know you're not being naughty, Jack. Right? You're being an angel? Are you being an angel? Little Jack here is digging at the base of our sunflowers that easily got twice as big as I expected. Can you see that flower?
That's the first one to open. It was starting to open yesterday. It just had a few petals sticking out. It was really funny. And it looks like, we'll be able to tell later on, maybe the next garden tour, if it has some red in it. From what I remember, the seeds did have, or were from flowers that had a little bit of red. It looks like those petals are yellow on the outside with a little bit of a darker coloring on the inside. Really pretty.
I've cleaned out this side of this garden bed, and I thought about putting something here, but I actually think I'm going to leave it. The loofah is growing so fast that it's going to come down here really in no time, and there's not going to be any sunlight for something that I put there.
That's okay. Next year I really need to start whatever vining thing on this side of the trellis so that whatever I put on the other side can at least get morning sun and then afternoon shade.
I have come through here and trimmed off some of the blackberry canes. They got a little bit wild. I'll share a clip here from last week, and I need to keep these guys in line if I want to still have access to this bed at some point, even if not this year. So you can see underneath that I did have some disease going on. This is probably just from lack of airflow. It's kind of crazy in there. Someone had a question too about dead canes. Seeing something like this inside your blackberry plant. And you'll see this for a variety of reasons. For me, it's often because it is one of these more center and more shaded canes.
You can probably tell that everything looks kind of wet. We have a very heavy dew every morning, and disease happens, and not all canes are going to make it. But Also, I wanted to mention, you guys remember that this is the year that we had that double bloom or double hatching of cicadas. Cicadas will lay their eggs in the smaller branches on trees, but also brambles. They do like blackberries and things. So if you're seeing maybe the last 6 inches of the canes or the new growth is sort of dead, snapped, and broken off, cicadas might be the reason that you're seeing that. But this happens, I really wouldn't worry too much about it. This is just the plant pruning itself. Sometimes if I pull and the cane is loose, I'll take it out, but I usually don't worry about it too much. We're getting some massive berries on the plant this year. And I need to harvest today, but I'm not gonna do that on video. Speaking of harvesting, I did not harvest any of the flowers from last week, so we have many more blooms this week. Zinnias stay bloomed for a really long time. And seeing this bed filled out like this makes me so happy. Next to the zinnia, I have a few beds that I had pulled some winter stuff out of that I did plant some more things in. So down here, I have some squash. These are patty pan squash. I believe these ones are the white patty pan, and over there is a yellow patty pan. You can see I have more than one seed in the planting hole. I do that just to ensure that something will germinate in that planting hole. And you can probably hear the tons of birds that we have on our property. Birds really like fresh seedlings, and they do pick at them from time to time. It's less of a problem this time of year, but if I can start out with several, if the birds happen to pick at one so much that it dies, I have the other ones. I will thin these out, but I will wait until they have their first true leaves. Same thing over here. I've got a lot of plants in this planting hole, and see, this one already has a little bit of bird damage. This is quite a few plants. This is more than I really need as like a backup, so I'm gonna start to thin these out. And then I'll leave these. These are melons. I forget the exact type. I'll put it in the words down here. But these apparently get really big. So I've just planted one here and kind of assumed that it's going to take over this whole area. By the time it starts to take over, these okra will be pretty big and unaffected. I had planted some okra that I had saved the seed from. Goodness, it was probably a month ago. And I had okay germination, but not great. Some of the birds came and took some, but also some of them were having a hard time growing in the planting medium that I had them in. So these are 2 from that planting. These are Okinawa pink okra, but that okra was a volunteer. Last year I had a really big okra plant growing right here. It was basically an okra tree, and that was the Alabama red okra. So that's what this is. I really wasn't sure what I was gonna put here, but when I saw that volunteer, I said, okay, we can make this an okra bed. So the okra is gonna be on this side, and for sure the melon's gonna creep in over here. These guys should be pretty tall with the melon underneath, so that'll be nice. We had some pretty high winds come through here a couple of days ago. This zinnia did have many more branches, but with each windstorm, more and more snap off. You can see where they were down here, but it's starting to put out some fresh growth down here. So we'll see. This is one of my favorite types, the candy cane zinnia. The wind came in this way from the west towards the east, and you can see that the plants on this side of the garden are pretty windswept. It almost looks like the dog laid down right here. He might have, but I have not seen him in my garden at all, so I don't know. I think this is probably just from the wind. I just tried to stand it back up and that snapped off, so I guess I'll probably leave that alone. My dill was looking pretty windswept a couple of tours ago, and it still looks windswept. Now, a lot of the heads have gone to seed. These yellow flowers have been pollinated and turned into this seed here. And I expected that to just mean that the plants were done, but it looks like they've actually put on a lot more flowering heads, which is awesome. I have some cucumbers growing out on the lane and in the greenhouse, and we'll look at those. And I use the flowering dill heads in my pickle recipe, so I'm excited to see that these are still here, and there's a lot of them. Still no swallowtail butterflies. I was weed whacking over here yesterday. I noticed that I have a pretty sizable tomato plant here. This one might be a black beauty tomato. That is what I had growing over here last year. The stem does look just a tad purple, and you'll see that on varieties of tomatoes that have the purpling on their fruits, the anthocyanins.
It smells like onions over here. These are my walking onions. They've seen better days. This is kind of par for the course for them. Dying back just as onions do. It's a weed. While weeding in this particular bed, I noticed that I had yet another tomato right there. But there's also a ground cherry. Like, that's pretty big. It already has fruit on it. Ultimately, these trellises are for the grapes that we have. They're filling out the trellis really nice. So I won't be trellising this up intentionally, and if it does happen to try to smother out all my other perennials, I will probably take that out, but for now I'm gonna leave it. We have a tomato over here that's really, really enjoying sharing the bed with this zinnia and these Kelway golden chamomile. I really need to come through and take off some of the spent heads over here so we can get some prettier blooms. There's actually a few different zinnia over here. We've got another candy cane. And then this one is the Queen Lime Blush that we all really love. In the back, it's quite wild, but very productive still. Our asparagus, we have not harvested them in probably about a month now, so I've allowed them to grow, and this is what they do. They form this really dense, thick fern that looks like it has frost on it. That's all the dew from this morning.
It does get kind of hard to walk through here as the fern sort of flops over, but it's okay.
We've got stuff flopping over from both sides. This is some of the dill. You can see the seeds have come off most of it, so I may just cut that out. I have this volunteer bean here that I really like, but I'm getting a little bit concerned that it's taking over the trellis a little bit too much and starting to kind of choke out the progress of the grape on this trellis. You might be able to see, but the bean itself is growing all over this dill. I think it might be too much of a problem to leave, so I may need to pull that out even though I really like it.
I do have more of this seed, and beans are a really quick turnaround crop. That's something that we could start from seed in August and still get a harvest from, especially if we put the seed in the ground inside the greenhouse. And I have all those arches in the greenhouse for something like a pole bean to climb on, and so I'm thinking about that for later on in the season.
So we may see her again.
I did a vlog on this recently. Our elderberry have really started to ripen. As they ripen, the heads get very heavy and it basically bends the whole plant downward.
See, I've already made a harvest of a 7-gallon bucket full of elderberry, so I think I'm good.
Unless the plant looks like it's just going to break from the weight, I'm gonna leave these. The birds have been coming through and taking their fill, which really has not been a lot for some reason. They don't love these as much as they love something like seedlings. I do want to take care of this though.
Webworms, these are a problem, I am told. As we walk back to the garden, I realize there is something that I have not really shown you, I think, at all on the garden tours. You see this lovely grapevine here? It's really, really long.
This grapevine, I thought the previous owner of our house planted. It was kind of bushy down at the base of this power pole for years, and I was really sad that it didn't seem to be producing much. I fertilized it, I tended it, but what I didn't do was prune it. I didn't know how to prune grapes at the time, so I did some research when I got my other grapes.
And I realized that I needed to prune this to one stem. You can see we've got more grape growth going on down here, and I don't want this. These are basically like suckers. So when the side shoots are pruned, you get this long stem that you can encourage along a line like this. This is an old clothesline, and it's more than halfway to the tree at this point. Pretty cool, huh?
There's probably something that I need to do with these long bits. I'm sure I read about it and need to read about it again, but I don't know what variety this is. I talked to the woman that used to have this house, and she said that there's a vineyard in town, so like a mile away, and her kids have toured the vineyard before, and probably some of the seed, you know, the kids spit it out or whatever, and that is what this is. So maybe I could ask them over at the vineyard. I don't really know them though.
It just gets to be a surprise. We probably won't get grapes this year, but this will establish the plant and we should be able to get fruit next year. I was thinking about taking this one, putting it on a string and attaching it to the carport.
We'll see. I sometimes do crazy things like that.
So back in front of the elderberries, I have this bed here that I allowed my cilantro to go to seed in. So the cilantro is basically, I mean, not basically, it is. It's dead and gone, but it's left behind us, these little seed pods. And this is actually the spice coriander. It's very easy to harvest. It comes off the plant very readily, which is how we get so many volunteers every year.
I do collect this every single year, and I don't do much with it. I have a few recipes that call for coriander, but I really want to try a coriander bread this year.
Behind us, we have this bed that I attempted to plant potatoes in. When the potatoes didn't really sprout, we had just a ton of rain this spring and they rotted instead of sprouting. But I decided that because my compost bin has so much going on as far as volunteers and things, I would use this as a compost bin during the growing season. We have a house rabbit, and so his litter goes in here when it's done. And then, you know, household scraps and things.
The trimming that I did of this blackberry cane, once those canes die completely, I'll put those in here. I took out those lettuces that were lining the one side of the archway. Those lettuces will go here. I've just got everything in a pile right now.
And so by next season, we should have been able to fill this bed pretty high with just compost scraps.
And so that's nice. Clearly compost grows things pretty well.
We have a lot of this bindweed. I talked about this last week, how it doesn't necessarily bother me that it's here. It's been on our farm ever since we moved here 5 years ago, and it hasn't really taken over any garden space. This is not technically a garden space. I do have a volunteer tromboncino squash in here that has seen better days. It's still alive somewhat, this particular plant. I did notice that the fruits on this particular side of the vine are starting to turn yellow. There's one down there.
Eventually they will ripen, like the rind will turn tough, and they'll ripen to the color of a butternut. And it tastes a lot like a butternut too.
On this side, we've got this wild tomato plant. This is incredible. I don't think I've ever seen one of these tomatoes get this big. This is a yellow currant tomato. All the tomatoes are green right now. There might be some ripe ones down at the bottom, but I'm not going to be digging for them. See that? This tomato essentially grows like a weed here on our homestead, but you can see amongst the tomato, we do have some healthy tromboncino leaves. There is a squash bug present here. Can you see those eggs? You can scratch off the squash bug eggs and let them fall, and that's one method of control.
Because this is a volunteer plant, I'm not going to worry too much about being super picky about keeping this alive.
We have harvested quite a few surprise fruit off of this already, and I'm sure there'll be more. Look, there's a big one hiding under here. Can you see it there? That is so funny. Cracks me up.
So like many areas of our garden this year, this area is a work in progress. This was our kids' old garden, and it's a lot to maintain. There's just a lot of area where grass grows. So I've just been weed whacking where I don't want grass to grow.
We had some lovely volunteer tomatoes pop up in this space, and I'm leaving them. I think that this is more yellow currant tomato, but over here, I think we have some slicers. I don't remember the varieties of tomatoes that grew on this trellis last year. They were also volunteers. But see how this one has a little bit darker of a stem? You can really tell when you put these two next to each other. This one probably does not have any purpling on the tomato, but this one looks like it probably does. So I've just been weed whacking around these plants and leaving them. These are the grapes that are in here. These are Sunbelt grapes. They ripen to purple. I don't think we talked about the beans. We talked about the sunflowers and the loofah, but check out the beans. They've gotten an amazing second wind. This is incredible, and it looks like we're starting to see beans big enough. That means we're ready to do our second round of harvests in here.
I've made lots of different harvests off of this little bean area of the garden, and then they kind of stopped. They put on some new growth and some new flowers, and now we've got more beans.
See? Those are definitely harvestable, and I'm sure there's a lot more. We had started to see some signs of disease. This is some of the older leaves, and you can pick these out. I often do. But you can see the new growth looks really, really good. Tons of blooms. Many more beans.
During a vlog this past week, I started some strawberries from seed, and when those are big enough to transplant, I think that this is where I'd like to put them. They're actually a proven winners variety called buried treasure, and they have a pink blossom instead of a white blossom like you most commonly see.
The Tiny Tim tomatoes that we currently have in this Greenstock are definitely seeing the end of their life. I think they're just about done. We've harvested quite a few off of this Greenstock.
And they're really good. There's a lot of very nice complex flavor in this tomato. And you know what? A lot of times the little dwarf tomatoes are kind of just more bred for their size and not necessarily for flavor, but this one is actually really good.
We're going to walk out to the pumpkin patch before we go to the greenhouse, but I wanted to show you. My key lime has put on some new flowers. This particular plant hasn't done anything but really grow roots and grow foliage, which is fine. Maybe because this is a first year spot for these particular plants, I should have been pulling off fruit to allow this plant to do the same, but you know, sometimes I break the rules. This is some of the fruit that it's put on earlier in the year, and we're gonna have some brand new ones. Can you see the little tiny baby limes? I think that's so cool.
This particular planter is on wheels and this shed is heated, so in the wintertime, this shed is where that plant is gonna live.
Good morning. Kids' garden is doing awesome. A lot of their cucumbers are trailing down on the sides of the bed as well as up the trellis. They have been eating cucumbers galore. I noticed that this was happening on this cucumber. Can you see how it's a little bit funny shaped? It's kind of bigger at the base and then shorter, pointier, and kind of curled towards the bottom. While in contrast, this cucumber looks a little bit more normal.
That funny shape often happens when the heat sets in of the summer. It's a pollination issue, and I have heard that pollen can almost go sterile in the heat. A lot of people will say that cucumbers go bitter when the heat sets in of summer. We have never experienced that, and I don't know what the difference is. This morning the low is 68, I think, so maybe our evenings have been cool enough to not trigger some kind of bitter flavor in the cucumbers, but no year, even our hottest years, has our cucumbers really tasted bitter unless I let them get a little bit too far in their cycle and they've already started to really develop the seeds inside of the fruit. But yeah, so far so good with these. Check out the amazing amount of growth in the pumpkin patch. These are Dutch fork pie pumpkins, and last week we saw our first female flower that we pollinated, and there are a bunch now.
Well, I just scared the bees out of there, but the bees have really been loving the blossom, so there's not only a lot of flowers, there's been a lot of pollination. So we're gonna have all kinds of pumpkins as long as they live long enough.
The reason that I went with this particular pumpkin variety for this area is because this is a pumpkin that's more designed for the south. We have things like squash bugs and squash vine borers, and to try to manage that organically with a patch like this would be pretty hard. And so these plants are pretty resistant to those kinds of pests, and they're used to growing in the heat. We have had heat indexes the last little while well above 100, up to 110, and they haven't wilted at all. So I'm really enjoying this variety so far.
The pumpkin that we pollinated last week is somewhere in here. I am going to lose it eventually, but there it is. Can you see it down there? It's, for lack of a better comparison, it's the size of a toddler's head. And like I mentioned, many, many more have bloomed and been pollinated. You can see that I've come through and mowed. I wanted to give the pumpkins the upper hand of the grass, and so far it looks like it's working okay. This here is a volunteer squash plant that the bees are also loving. I don't know what variety this is. It is not a tromboncino, I will tell you that. It has spines on the stem. So far, it has not put on anything more than just male flowers, so I haven't been able to tell what variety it is. I expect by the time the pumpkin comes over here, that is not going to live, because this pumpkin is really big and aggressive.
But that's okay. Hopefully we get to at least see what it wanted to be when it grew up.
Pretty sure that this pumpkin was pollinated yesterday. See how big that is? I'm so excited about this. I did have some volunteer melons out here that Unfortunately, most of them I did have to mow.
The pumpkins were just getting a little bit too close to them, and I wanted the pumpkin to really have ownership of this space.
I tried to leave this melon here, but it didn't like what I did yesterday. I might have actually gotten too close to it with the weed whacker. That does appear to be the case.
Yeah, I tried. I failed. I am pretty sure after seeing some little tiny underdeveloped melons on some of the other ones that I took out that this was an armpit melon. I do have armpit melons growing elsewhere. Let's go check those out. Each of these 15-gallon grow bags has one armpit melon growing in each, and these guys have started to grow by leaps and bounds. There's a lot of new foliage on here, as well as stink bug.
They've put out the little tendrils and are starting to climb up this trellis. And I noticed that we have a lot of blooms. So far, I have not noticed any female blooms, just a bunch of male blooms. See, there's no like underdeveloped fruit at the base of the flower, but this is good. This is progress.
Really quick, if you don't know what an armpit melon is, it's something of an accidental creation on our farm. What I think is a cross between a Kajari melon and a Charente melon, and it makes this melon that looks like a Kajari, but it's got a more muted type coloring on it. It's got a fuzzy texture, and the inside, instead of being green like a Kajari, it is orange, and it also has a very strong musky flavor that is also melony. So I've said before that it's a lot like you've been working outside for hours, and so you're sweaty and gross, and instead of taking a shower you decide, I'll just throw some deodorant on. You try to mask that very musky smell with deodorant. That is what this melon smells like. Exactly.
But I've said it before, it's not like it's a bad thing. It's actually quite interesting, and I really enjoy it. It almost has a savory type aftertaste to it. I cannot wait for these to fruit. Behind it, I have a volunteer cucumber. I believe that this is going to be a gherkin cucumber. That's what I grew here last year. I did have some different types of slicers down there, so it's possible that some of the seed came this way, but I do know that I left a lot of these on, and a lot of them just kind of broke open right here, so that's what I expect this is. See, it looks like there's a little bud right here that has a little baby cucumber at its base, so next week we should be able to tell exactly what that is. Over here, these are our chicken and dumplings cowpeas. They've filled out a bunch. I'm so happy with the way that these have been growing. I remember last year when I grew black-eyed peas, I worried for a little bit when they just seemed to get bushier and bushier and didn't travel up the trellis, that maybe the variety that I had was a bush variety. But then as soon as I had that thought, they started to put out these really long, not quite tendrils, but just long stems that wrapped around the trellis that I had inside the greenhouse. And so I expect to see those little things soon. This is my first time growing this variety, but the seed packet did say that it needed trellising, so we've got that.
I know I've seen some people grow cowpeas along the ground. I don't think that a trellis is expressly necessary. It just may make harvesting easier.
So this whole planting space we call the lane, and the chicken and dumplings cowpeas are way down there. They take up about a third of the trellis, and then down here we're starting the conversion of this space into a raised bed space. As you can see, we've already gotten this one in and planted. This is a 10-foot birdie's bed. I have started to roll back the trellis from this side because I think we're going to be putting cattle panels up here just to give this space a more sturdy type of trellis. But I have planted a bunch of melons. I need to thin these out a little bit.
I can tell that the birds have gotten to these a little bit too, so I'm not going to be taking all of them out. I'm just going to be pulling a few that are obviously too close together, and I'll let the other ones get their first seedling leaves before I decide who's going to be the one that grows for us this summer. These two planting holes are Kajari melons. And then down here, these two planting holes are honey melons. My first time growing these. The conversion of this space to a raised bed space is going to take some time. Establishing raised beds, really of any type, is labor intensive alone, but it's also a little bit expensive.
So for now, we'll grow in ground on this side. I forgot to show you this. I've been forgetting to show you this because clearly this is getting quite big. This is a volunteer birdhouse gourd. So because I don't have anything really beyond this point, I'm going to try to train this birdhouse gourd up here and let it grow up the trellis. We'll see how well it establishes. So far it looks like it's got some pretty well established roots down there. There's actually quite a few different plants. I have a volunteer birdhouse gourd down here too. These guys, their flowers come on mostly in the evening because they attract a moth for pollination. You can see that white flower back there. It's starting to close up because we're getting into daytime. But I've noticed we've got some little baby birdhouse gourds. There's one right here. Isn't that cute? So our greenhouse is a work in progress as well. We are transitioning from an in-ground space to a raised bed space in here. I decided I would place our peppers in ground. My husband scared the crap out of me again.
Tripping on a brick.
There's a lot of stuff to trip on in here. Whew. Without the fans, doesn't it heat up? Oh my gosh, they make such a big difference.
Bye.
Bye, love you. They've only been off for like 10 minutes.
Yeah, I believe it doesn't take long.
Anyway, back to the peppers. At this point, I'm really glad that I filled out some tags because a lot of these peppers are new to me this year and I cannot remember what they are. This one is a Marconi. I noticed that these guys are going from green to a little bit of a yellow, so we might be starting to ripen to the final stage of red over on this plant. Some plants have more peppers on them than others. Part of this is I have started to harvest a lot of these, especially the jalapenos, because they're ready. These ones are not jalapeno, so they are heatless jalapeno. Over here is a Tamdu jalapeno, and we have made some cream cheese with peppers in it. It's really chev with peppers in it. It's been delicious. Over here is one of the peppers that is doing the best at climbing the string trellis that I have. This is the Pippin's Golden Honey, and the peppers actually start out a very, very dark purple, and then they ripen to like a golden orange color, and this one is well on its way. So it looks like the flowers start out purple. The pepper is a light green at first. I don't have another one that is super dark purple, but that one might be super dark purple next week, and then it stays purple for a long time before it starts to ripen. I can't wait to try these. This is a sweet pepper. It looks like very soon we'll be able to harvest some of these bell peppers. These are King of the North. These guys are essentially bred to produce earlier than other peppers. It's kind of in the name with these, King of the North. The northern parts of the world tend to have a shorter growing season because the frost comes a lot sooner and it leaves a lot later, and so something like this will produce a lot faster in a shorter growing season. I would definitely say that that's true because these are sizable. Look at that. Those are good. I had a peppergate situation happen where I thought I planted jalapeno seed, but I got this instead. Now this is not a sweet Hungarian like people have suggested. This pepper is a hot pepper, so maybe a hot Hungarian. I'm really excited about this particular pepper. They're like a fat teardrop shape. These are pimento peppers. There's quite a few peppers on that little plant. This one I think is Corno del Toro. It's hard for me to tell. Yeah, it's hard for me to tell the difference between that and a Marconi. We've got Corno del Toro here. This is the other Marconi that I have. And I have harvested one of the big peppers off the bottom because I just needed a pepper for a recipe. We're gonna let this one ripen to red for sure. The peppers that are over here are getting a little bit shaded out by some of the things that I have going on in this bed right here. There are some ground cherries that have gotten quite big, but this is not the final growing space that we're going to have in the greenhouse. This is going to be the walkway, so they are closer than they would be if they were planted in the bed. They'd be more back here. They do get plenty of sun though. There's nothing really shading the greenhouse except for the shade cloth itself, and so they do still get plenty of sun. If you were not aware, full sun is 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight every day. And so right now it's 7 a.m. and the sun isn't going to set until about 8:30 p.m. The sun isn't super intense that whole time, but they get plenty of sunlight, even though it's not the entire day's worth. These two beds that I have on the end here are not performing as well as some of my other beds. Part of this is that I don't think that there's any compost from our farm in this bed. It is only raised bed soil. Raised bed soil by itself has a lot lacking, especially nowadays. So a lot of these plants are pretty spindly. My poor eggplant. We've got one little eggplant here. She's hanging on. They're trying. These eggplants are doing a little bit better as far as foliage, so I'm hoping that they're just going to be late bloomers, literally, as far as their fruits. Now, I am noticing a little bit of crinkling here, just like we had on some of our plants from last week.
If you were not here for the garden tour last week, it's just a very quick recap. We live in the middle of agricultural farmland, and one of the closest fields did spray 2 weeks ago, and I don't know what they sprayed, but when they sprayed, I put on the sprinklers in the raised bed garden. That usually knocks whatever it is out of the air, and it doesn't affect my garden. But the fans that we have in here this year seem to have drew some of that in, and I do have what looks to me like immunopyrrolid damage,
like herbicide damage on a lot of these plants. I'm not entirely sure that that is what's going on. It's just my guess.
I'm guessing that because it's on a few different varieties of plants, tomatoes, eggplants, but also beans.
I told you guys I would show you how these beans progressed from the overspray, because usually when a plant experiences overspray, the only leaves that are affected are the ones that were sprayed, and then the new growth looks normal. Now, you can really see that happening here with this bean plant. This is one of the leaves that I showed you last week, and then we since have this. So this is the reasoning that I think that this is not disease. I do believe that this is Roundup overspray, because this is what I classically see when that is the case. Now, some of the plants were hit harder than others. This one looks particularly bad. You see how horrible that is down there? But this new growth is looking more normal for sure.
I had a couple people ask me if I thought that that was bean mosaic virus. It still could be. I don't know that I've ever seen that. I'm not gonna say that it's not that, because I don't know for sure. It just looks like Roundup overspray to me, and it does correlate pretty well with the spraying that I physically saw.
But correlation does not equal causation. I can definitely agree to that. But look, it's the evidence that's making me think that. These cherry tomatoes are not necessarily recovering as well. I did and do have tomato curly top virus going on in the greenhouse here, and so I think that that is also contributing. Last week, these leaves were very, very, very curled up, like a scroll, super tight, and they don't look amazing this week, but they look better. You see that? This is all new growth. They don't look amazing though, and I will acknowledge that.
Since I talked about how our tomatoes really aren't doing as amazingly as I would like, I've had a lot of people ask me, hey Heather, my tomatoes are doing the same thing. Should I just pull them out? And my answer has been no. If you don't need something else to put in that spot, disease like this isn't necessarily a reason to yank out your plants. Something like blight would be a reason to take the plant out, because that can really travel very fast plant to plant, and blight can live in your soil.
Tomato curly top virus is spread with presence of aphids and whiteflies and other different insects and things, but it's not going to live on in the soil as far as I know. And a lot of the times the plants will still flower and set fruit, so you can still get somewhat of a harvest, even if it's not going to be the biggest harvest that you've ever seen. See, they're still producing well. We've got a lot of blooms, so I think things are going to be okay, even if not ideal.
And that's okay. That's a lot of gardening. That's a lot of homesteading. If you rip it out, you get nothing. And that's a lot harder to deal with, in my opinion. I would be more heartbroken. This breaks my heart as it is, but if I got nothing, I would be even sadder. Like right now, I could plant more beans. I could plant more sunflowers, but I couldn't necessarily plant a tomato from seed and expect to get ripe tomatoes from it. Maybe a cherry variety.
Over here, I mostly have slicer tomatoes, and these guys are looking a lot better. There's a little bit of curling. Some of this is just due to sunlight. My shade cloth in here is only a 30%. I kind of wish that I had something more like a 40 or a 50% shade cloth. But the tomatoes are doing really well. This one is a Dr. Witchy's. See how big it is? And then right next door I have the exact same variety of plant. This is also a Dr. Witchy's. It looks a little bit sick. I think this one has the tomato curly top virus and this one does not. You can see the difference in the fruit size here. This one is blushing, so it's done growing. It's just going to be ripening at this point. And next door, same variety of plant. These tomatoes are a lot bigger. this plant as a whole is a lot healthier. It's the same variety right next door, so it's obviously got the same soil. It's just this one has a little bit of disease and this one doesn't.
I wanted to update you guys too. It was a couple weeks ago that I noticed that I was having a lot of really small holes in my plants. It looked like flea beetle damage.
You can see some of it still here. I mean, the leaves themselves are not going to heal from the damage, but much like with the overspray damage from the Roundup, the new leaves should get better if your pests are well handled or well managed. And so it looks like we had success with spraying on the spinosad. There are still a few little holes, but you know, you can't expect perfection. This is good enough for me. Now, not all of the ground cherries came through that. We do have quite a few that have passed, but that's okay. We've got plenty. This is definitely another thing I need to come through and harvest because there's a lot of ground cherries down here.
I grew a bunch of them because everybody in my family absolutely loves ground cherries. They're so, so good. One of the reasons that I grew so many is I want to try and preserve some of these, and I have. I have recently made a ground cherry jelly. It's a freezer jam. Actually, it's not a jelly, it's a jam. And I did take a video of that, and you guys will see that in like probably 10 days or so.
Another variety that has started to ripen is the Kellogg's Breakfast. Beauty. Our pink oxheart started to ripen last week, and a lot of the tomatoes that are in here are cracking.
The soil that I have in these beds is the Kellogg's raised bed soil, and I do like it for the most part. One of the challenges that I'm having with it though is that it does retain moisture really well, and I feel like I needed to water my plants 1 inch of water every week, but that turns out that with this soil that's actually too much because it retains so much moisture that just keeps the plant's roots kind of soggy, and that's not good. So I'm actually looking for, I have a moisture meter somewhere.
I try to keep it in an obvious spot, but you know, I don't always succeed in that. Oh, there it is. I've had this moisture meter sitting in here probably since last week, and I have not watered. Can you see it says that it's wet? It's about 5 inches down, maybe 6. And wet isn't necessarily good. I wouldn't mind it to be in the moist kind of zone, but wet really isn't good for plant roots. So
instead of watering on a schedule, I have been watering when this signifies that we need to. And I have not actually watered in here for probably close to 3 weeks, and it still is reading wet.
See underneath this cracked tomato. Let's see where this plant is at. Oh, that one. Actually, let's see. Let's probe a few different spots. There we go. That's fine. That's good. This plant doesn't necessarily need water. The reason that I kind of poked around is there can be, you know, rodent holes or whatever going down in through the bed, and so if you place the probe in the middle of an air pocket, that's not going to be an accurate measurement. I don't know. It says that it's close to being dry. This says otherwise.
So I'm still trying to figure this out. I don't really know exactly how to work with these beds in this greenhouse quite yet, but I'm figuring it out.
These cucumbers that I have planted over here are called miniature white, and I did top dress this bed with that same soil, and I decided I wasn't going to put any mulch down because I don't necessarily want to be retaining tons and tons of moisture. I haven't watered this in a long time, and that is also reading wet way down low. Now it gets significantly drier the closer to the surface we get, but the plants, just by looking at them, they probably have their roots down pretty low because they look good. I think I'll leave that there. Over here is a very highly anticipated cherry tomato variety called Barry's Crazy Cherry. It is named so because of the crazy way that it sets its blooms and fruit. So as we go further down the plant, we get to the more developed fruit, and we have our first ripe one.
This has been sitting there yellow, staring at me for a couple of days, and I saved this just for this video so we can try it together. You know what? It's not quite,
but it's very, very close to the flavor of the yellow currant tomato that volunteers on my farm. Here are some volunteers that I decided to trellis up. They are a couple days away from actually touching the top of the greenhouse at this point. It looks intentional, right? But it's not. So let's grab one of these, and then grab another one of these.
I guess it wouldn't be too surprising that 2 yellow tomatoes kind of taste similar, but let's try this again. The yellow currant tomato does have a more savory note, and this guy's a little bit almost more sour. Definitely has a lovely zing to it. I really like that. Sometimes yellow tomatoes are a little bit underwhelming. Those 2 are very, very good. I'm happy about that for sure. So next door you'll see a tomato plant that is essentially defoliated. This plant is a ponderosa pink tomato. Lovely, some of the biggest fruit that we have here in the greenhouse, but it started to get blight down at the bottom. I think I might have a little bit of blight over here to show you. This, it's not good, okay? I've been picking the individual blighty leaves off. A lot of people will just rip out entire plants, but I don't really have the heart. See, there's a few little blighty leaves up here. I've just been picking them off as it seems necessary. There's still a lot of foliage on the top of the plant. I just want it to be able to ripen these. Look at how gorgeous they are. Speaking of ripe fruit, number 1, we'll look a little bit at our container peaches. I don't know how well these peaches are doing. Peach people, is it normal for them to just sort of lay their leaves down like this? They don't feel particularly wilted. It just looks funny to me. This is my first year with these. It's a bonfire peach tree. We do have peaches on here that are starting to get a little bit soft. They're not super big, but I guess that should probably be expected of a plant that probably shouldn't have been allowed to fruit this year. Let's see. Oh, it's kind of green. See, I don't know if those peaches are doing super well in those containers. Those particular containers do not have drainage holes necessarily. They have like a water reservoir at the bottom with air pruning strips, and it's supposed to be okay that way, but they are also filled with that soil that tends to hang on to moisture a lot, and I sort of wonder if our peach trees are not okay, because that's not a ripe peach, and it's soft and the leaves look weird. This peach right here is bigger and it's more firm, so I'm not quite sure, but I came over here to show you. Speaking of ripe tomatoes, this Roma tomato is doing quite well in here. The leaves are a little bit yellow. I did put some liquid fertilizer down into the container, but it's definitely time to come out and harvest some of these Romas, that's for sure. There had been a little bit of blight on this plant. See, there still is a little bit. And like the others, I've just been picking off the blighty looking leaves and just letting the plant go, hoping to get as much fruit out of it as possible. There's another tomato variety that I noticed blushing down here. This is the Berkeley's tie-dye, and I had mentioned, I'm actually going to take this off. The way that the tomato is shaped, it's kind of hard just to get to the stem. Oh man. Oh no. So that was more traumatic than it needed to be. I did not have shears with me, and I probably should not have progressed with pulling this off, but I had mentioned in previous videos that sometimes when you see tomatoes like this, it's called cat facing. So this tomato formed from several different tomato blossoms fusing together, and sometimes when that happens, you'll have one part of the tomato ripening before the rest of the tomato. This is very common to see. So I pulled this off so that I can put this part of the tomato in the freezer, and then I guess we could eat the rest of this part, but I'll probably just feed this part to the chickens. A lot of people will just pull off the fused blossoms when they see this, just to prevent it from happening, to get more of a consistent fruit on the plant. Heirloom varieties are pretty well known for doing stuff like this, but they don't do it all the time where the fruit isn't usable, you know? So here's an example of what that tomato is really supposed to look like when it comes from one blossom. This is also a Berkeley's tie-dye. Really big. So far no blushing, but it probably won't be long. Get the fans doing their thing in here again. It's incredible the difference that those fans have made in the environment inside the greenhouse this year. Thank you so much for coming with me into my greenhouse and my garden this week. We are starting to get into the heavy harvest season, so you'll probably see more videos about harvesting and preserving on the channel very, very soon. Look out for those, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys again soon.